was no intussusception observed in clinical trials, and so this is when we were just starting to recommend and license and recommend these vaccines for U.S. children, was about this period of time when we're working on the rotavirus vaccine project. The problem is that the policy body of the World Health Organization saw these great data on rotavirus vaccines and said, you know, we should include rotavirus vaccines into the national immunization program of regions and countries where we have efficacy data, which was the US and Europe and Latin America. But, you know, polio vaccines don't work as well in developing countries, and prior rotavirus vaccines didn't work as well. And so we're not going to recommend rotavirus vaccines until you generate some data. So we were in the interesting position, if we go back to this map, that we had highly effective rotavirus vaccines, but they were tested in the US and Europe and Latin America. So the World Health Organization was saying, we'll use them there, where essentially no children die, but we can't use them yet here, where all the children are dying because we don't have enough data. So, and just to tie in a little bit more, you know, Paul Offit is one of the developers who you mentioned of the Merck Rototec vaccine, actually. So he is a pretty smart guy who does it all. So our challenge was to conduct these efficacy trials in Africa and Asia, to generate these data, to inform the World Health Organization if they should or shouldn't recommend rotavirus vaccines. And again, until they recommend rotavirus vaccines, the UNICEFs and the Gavis don't step in. And these vaccines, as you probably know, are, you know, $120 a dose. So if somebody doesn't help pay for these vaccines and the WHO doesn't recommend these vaccines, these countries can't do it on their own. You heard what the African health minister said, 40 cents a dose. These are nowhere near that now or back then. So we had to think about, you know, which vaccine should we use, where, are the populations broadly representative, should we look at efficacy or effectiveness, and what are the logistical considerations? I mean, there were all sorts of questions that were asked because we knew these vaccines worked. That wasn't the question. The question was, does it work in these areas with these conditions and in the way this vaccine will be delivered in these places where children are dying from rotavirus? And we had money for these trials. I mean, obviously we had a finite amount of money, so it's how do we take the money we have to get the most information we can, you know, as fast as we can to tell us about rotavirus. And so what we decided is that we should test both the GSK and the Merck vaccine. A lot of people thought we should test them head-to-head. I did not want to test them head-to-head, not because I didn't necessarily want the answer, but I think there were two main reasons. One is a head-to-head trial of superiority is going to be a lot more children. And the second reason is, you know, they both look like good vaccines, and it's really better for the world and supply and demand and competitive pricing to have more than one manufacturer. And we've seen in the US what happens when people get out of the vaccine market and you don't have more than one manufacturer. So we decided, we actually ended up doing 3 clinical trials. Ideally, we wanted to do a trial of the Merck vaccine in Africa, a trial of the GSK vaccine in Africa, and a trial of the Merck vaccine in Asia and the GSK vaccine in Asia, which would have been 4. For partnership reasons and some disagreement with GSK on what should be done, we ended up doing, you know, one GSK trial, and that was in Africa. And you can see here, we had to pick sites that actually had the capacity to follow these children and to do a randomized controlled trial with IRB regulations and GCP regulations and everything else that has to go into a trial. But we also wanted these to be representative populations. So you're not going to have a vaccine that's useful in southern Africa if you don't go into areas that have a high prevalence of maternal HIV, for example. While the trials in the US excluded children with HIV, with HIV exposure or with proven HIV. We said, you know, if you do that, you don't have a vaccine that's practical for Africa. So we intentionally went into areas with high maternal HIV. So from 2005 to 2009, this is part of the team. As you can imagine, there were hundreds of field workers, but these are some of the lead investigators at the site. We did these 3 randomized controlled trials. It was over 12,000 children at multiple sites I showed you in 7 countries. And just to get an idea of how we did this is, you know, we gave these vaccines with routine EPI vaccines. So that's the WHO childhood immunization schedule, which includes oral poliovirus. So just to let you know, we knew before we did these studies that if you give oral poliovirus together with oral rotavirus, the immunogenicity, the antibody you get from the rotavirus, is cut in half, okay? We knew that's significant interference between these 2 vaccines. All the studies in Latin America and the US and Europe had been done with IPV. But we said, you can, again, it's like the HIV issue. You do not have a practical vaccine in any of these countries if you don't give it on the childhood immunization schedule. We can't separate it by 2 weeks. We've got to give oral polio with oral rotavirus. We know we might take a hit on immunogenicity, but that's what we have to do. We didn't exclude HIV positive infants. We didn't restrict breastfeeding, even though many people believe that there's lots of antibody to breastfeeding that might interact with a live vaccine. And importantly, we focused on severe disease. You know, as you know, every child gets rotavirus. We're not going to keep children from getting rotavirus. We want to keep children from getting sick and dying from rotavirus. So we used a very common scale that's been used all over the world called the Vesicari scale, which rates dehydration and number of diarrheal episodes and vomiting and fever and puts a score on that and rates the severity of an episode. So here's what we found. Our first trial results came from South Africa and Malawi, and we found that the rotavirus vaccine was 61% efficacious against severe disease. Now remember, this is a vaccine that was 85 to 95% efficacious in the US against severe disease. There were people who were disappointed by this, but fortunately, my epidemiologic training told me that, you know, efficacy is relative, of course, and I would ask you, you know, would you rather have 60% of Bill Gates' salary or 99% of my salary? I think you would be crazy if you answered 99% of my salary, even though 99 is clearly above 60. And so we took a closer look at the number of severe episodes we were preventing. And here's what we saw. In the US with a vaccine, if you vaccinate 100 children, you prevent about 1 severe case of rotavirus gastroenteritis. In South Africa, if we vaccinated 100 children, we prevented about 2.5 episodes of severe gastroenteritis. And when we went into Malawi, which is one of the poorest countries in the world, we had a 50% efficacy. But when we looked at the background rate of severe rotavirus gastroenteritis, it was 8 per 100. So a phenomenal background rate, and that's in the first year of life. So even if our efficacy is 50%, we're preventing 4 severe cases of gastroenteritis for every 100 children we vaccinate. So I would say this vaccine is 4 times better or more cost-effective in Malawi than it is in the United States, even though the efficacy is much lower. And when you consider these are children who may not get to the hospital in time, who don't get oral rehydration therapy, who don't get IV and may die from this disease, then I think the numbers become even more remarkable. So I won't go through the details with you on all of these studies, but basically it was interesting when you looked at it. You know, the efficacy we got, even under these conditions of including children with HIV, giving the polio, was somewhere between 50 and 65% in all of these areas in all of these studies. And in fact, again, what that translates into with some modeling over a 15-year period of time, if you take the median value, with a 60% efficacy, you could save almost 2 million lives with conservative estimates of introduction and uptake. And again, just to do some math, it would take about 40,000 years of rotavirus vaccine in the United States to save 1.7 million lives, because children don't die of rotavirus in the US. We probably had somewhere between 25 to 50 deaths a year before the introduction of rotavirus vaccine. So with a 98% efficacy, you're preventing maybe at most 50 cases a year. So it's really that burden of illness is so much greater in these countries that, that even these vaccines with moderate efficacy make a difference. So where we're at now is these vaccines are starting to be introduced, and at the same time, it's similar to the meninge story. Even though this is a good efficacy, in my opinion, and absolutely worth introducing these vaccines, there's still a lot of disease left that we can prevent. So while we're introducing these vaccines, we're working on the next generation of vaccines that can hopefully overcome some of the immunogenicity and other issues that make them less efficacious in these children. Now, I don't know, actually in the same New England Journal publication that published the results of our trial, they published this, what I think is amazing data from Mexico, where they had introduced the GSK vaccine, and you can see there that arrow, they had countrywide introduction of vaccine. Of course, rotavirus in Mexico is a winter disease, just like it is in the US. You see the dramatic declines in diarrheal deaths during the winter season in Mexico, again, starting in the age groups where the vaccine was introduced, and then as the cohorts got older, seeing it in older age groups as well. In a clinical trial, it's hard to have a death outcome. It would take a lot of children, and what we tried to do in these trials is have improved standard of care. We visited the homes every week to see if the child had diarrhea. We brought them in much sooner than they would be brought in a real-world situation. So it's this post-marketing type of data where you're going to see dramatic effects on death. And we actually think these efficacy estimates could be an underestimate, because if you look at the data in the United States after introduction, you see a reduction in gastroenteritis hospitalization among children too young or too old to be vaccinated, which suggests that there is some indirect effects, some herd immunity from rotavirus vaccination. And if we can achieve that in some of these low-resource countries, then perhaps we can make up for some of that diminished efficacy. So I think we talk a lot about numbers of deaths, and you brought this up too. Over 5 million children died from rotavirus vaccine. It's almost too staggering in a way to get our hands around it. And in fact, when we talk to lay audiences, we do try to do exactly what Jay said, is, give the example of the mother in Ghana with the child having diarrhea that lives 2 hours from the clinic, and unfortunately, she makes the decision where she waits too long, and that child dies from dehydration. But the World Health Organization did recommend that globally people introduce rotavirus vaccines, and so we would really like to change this paradigm and not report how many children die from rotavirus vaccines, but again, hopefully say in this decade that how many children did we keep from dying because we introduced rotavirus vaccines into these countries? So in conclusion, again, I think I'm probably preaching to the choir on this one, but we know that vaccines are one of the most successful and cost-effective public health interventions that we have. There are millions of children throughout the world who are under-immunized or unimmunized. And again, PATH is working in a number of vaccine programs to try to close this gap and ensure that access to these vaccines is there for everyone. So thank you.
I'd like to introduce to you a lovely young lady, Ms. Leslie Meggs. Leslie has flown in from Texas to be with us here tonight and is supported by her mother, Wendy, in the audience. We want you to hear Leslie's story of how meningitis has changed her life in so many ways. Leslie?
Good evening. My name is Leslie Meggs, and I'm 21 years old, and I just wanted to share with you guys my story with bacterial meningitis and how it has changed my life and how it will continue to change my life for as long as I'm here. I was 8 years old when I was diagnosed with meningitis, and the strange thing about it is I had always been a healthy kid. I had never been sick before in my entire life, other than a minor cold once or twice. And so when I woke up one morning not feeling too well, it was really out of character for me. And so my mom took me to the doctor to see what was going on. And I was one of those kids. I tried to push back any types of pain or any types of distress because I always wanted to play and enjoy myself. So I got to the doctor's office and I was swinging my legs on the table and enjoying myself and being polite and saying hello. So of course he didn't see anything wrong with me, and he sent me home. But as the day progressed, so did my symptoms. And by the end of the day, my mom was calling the doctor every hour because I had thrown up. I was throwing up every hour. My fever had reached 106 degrees was the highest it reached that night. And there was a point where I was laying on the bed, and I turned to my mom and I said, "Mom, look at the dresser. Do you see on your dresser?" And she said, "Do I see what?" And I said, "The angels that are on your dresser. Do you see the 2 angels on your dresser?" And it was at that point that we knew that something just wasn't right. And so she laid me aside from the bed because she had to change out the sheets because I threw up again. And I was laying on my stomach. And she noticed these weird purple spots all over the back of my legs. And she said, "Leslie, what happened to you?" And being 8 years old, I was like, "Oh, I probably fell at recess. It's probably just a bruise. Not a big deal." And she just kind of said, "Oh, okay." And then she looked at the back of my arms, and she saw them starting to appear on my arms. And she turned me over, and she saw them all over my stomach, all over my hands, and all over my face. And that's when she called the ER. And she told the nurse how bad everything was getting, that my temperature was still getting worse. And the nurse said the same thing, just let her rest, give her Tylenol, she'll be fine, put her in an ice bath. And my mom said, "Look, something is not right. She's still feeling sick, it's getting worse, and now there's this weird purple rash that's covering her body, and it's all irregular shaped, and it's growing." And at that point, the nurse completely freaked out. She said, oh my God, you need to bring her in right away. She's dying. She's critical." When I got to the ER, they kept me in the waiting room while they got everything checked out because it was very full in there. And I remember they gave me this little vomit cup because I was still very nauseous and still throwing up very consistently. And when people would walk past me, I mean, they would look at me and they would keep as big of a distance as they could because I looked like I popped out of a sci-fi movie. I had all these purple spots all over my face. And finally, they brought me back, and they did the normal temperature, weight, blood pressure thing, and then they did a spinal tap. And when my spinal fluid came back completely clear, they decided that they immediately needed to call a life flight helicopter to come and pick me up because the ambulance would have taken way too long and I wouldn't have made it. When we landed on top of Texas Children's Hospital, they immediately wheeled me into the ICU. And the last thing I remember is laying in the bed. They wouldn't let my parents come with me, and them shoving needles in my arms and legs and tubes down my nose and throat. And I just remember lying there and crying and praying that the pain would go away and asking for my mom, asking for my dad. I ended up spending 2 whole months at Texas Children's Hospital. I was in a coma for 3 weeks, and I was on a ventilator for 3 weeks. There was one point where I had to learn how to walk all over again because I had been bedridden for so long. But even though the meningitis didn't take my arms and my legs, it took my kidneys, it took my motor function, and it gave me scars covering my body. And so 2 months later, when I was discharged from the hospital, it wasn't a disease that just went away just because it was treated. I was on dialysis for a very long time afterwards because my kidney function had completely shut down. I had to go to physical therapy for a very long time, which was absolutely excruciating as an 8-year-old. So somehow my kidney function improved to the point where I could get the dialysis catheter taken out and I could function without needing a transplant or anything. And so I went about 12 years of my life living a completely healthy life. I took basic medications to make sure my kidney function didn't decline anymore, and I thought that it was all over. My junior year of high school, I went to this one appointment with my nephrologist, and he sat my family down and he said, "I know it's been 12 years, this is a natural thing, but we're going to need to perform a kidney transplant. Her kidney function is declining. It's not getting better no matter what we do. She's going to need a transplant." And at the time, I was very involved in high school. I did all types of student government and debate, and I just looked at him and I said, "I really don't have time for a transplant. I mean, I'm way too busy for this." And he kind of was like, okay. And so we ended up going home, and my parents and we found this alternative to a transplant, something that could kind of prolong the kidney function or slow down the decline of kidney function. And it was this low-protein vegan diet where you took amino acid supplements 3 times a day. So I thought, why not? And so for the next 2 years, instead of getting a transplant, I had max 10 grams of protein a day and took probably close to 30 pills a day so that I wouldn't become malnourished and that I could keep my kidney function going as much as I could. And so going to the movies with friends, no popcorn, no ices, because then I also had to watch out for the normal potassium and sodium levels. And so I really didn't have much to eat at all. And that was a very big lesson in self-control, but it took away my normal high school life because of a disease that's prevented by a vaccine. So when I started college, my freshman year, I decided that I wanted to study biochemistry and eventually get into medicine. And so my course load was and still is very heavy, and I couldn't keep up with my diet as well. And so my kidney function started declining again. And my nephrologist said this was a great diet while it lasted. Look how well it worked, but we really don't have any other option now. We're going to need to do a kidney transplant. And so the first 2 people they tested were my parents, and both of them luckily were a match. My dad was a little bit better of a match than my mom. So they started prepping him for the transplant. So that first entire semester of college, my kidney function just kept declining, declining, and declining as they were preparing me for the transplant. And I lived in the dorms, so I was away from home as well. And there were points where I would get out of bed in the morning and I would hop onto the floor and my feet were so swollen because of the kidney failure that they would jiggle. I was throwing up on a daily basis. The taste of metallic, that effect of kidney failure, you could smell it off of my mouth. And for some reason, I still stayed in classes, and I found a way to adapt to it, but it was hard. I couldn't go out, I couldn't do anything, and I had this diet to stay on top of. But I had a transplant to look forward to. So the second semester of my freshman year, my dad donated his kidney to me, and I thought, now everything's gonna go back to normal. Everything is going to be healthy again. I'm not going to have a worry in the world.